While other mobsters chased headlines and glamour, he controlled the docks, the unions, and the money. And nobody even knew his name. Ernesto Tino Fiumara was born in 1941 in Newark, New Jersey, in a neighborhood where the smell of the docks mixed with the smoke from factories and the stench of corruption. This was a world where longshoremen loaded and unloaded cargo from morning until night, where union bosses had more power than mayors, and where the Genovese crime family controlled everything that moved through the port of New York and New Jersey. Young Tino grew up watching ships arrive from distant lands, containers full of goods worth millions, and he understood something fundamental. Whoever controlled the waterfront controlled the world. His father worked the docks, breaking his back for pennies while mob-connected union bosses drove Cadillacs and lived in mansions. Tino saw the disparity, understood the game, and made a decision early. He wasn't going to be a worker. He was going to be an owner. Not of ships or cargo, but of the system that controlled everything that passed through those docks. He was going to own the invisible infrastructure that made commerce possible, and he was going to do it so quietly that nobody would even know his name until it was too late. Newark in the 1940s and 1950s was mob territory, divided between various crime families but dominated by the Genovese family, the most powerful and sophisticated criminal organization in America. The Genovese didn't operate like the flashy gangsters portrayed in movies. They were businessmen who happened to use violence and corruption as tools. They controlled unions, political machines, construction, garbage collection, and most importantly, the waterfront. And they needed smart, disciplined soldiers who understood that the real money wasn't in street-level crimes but in controlling legitimate industries through illegitimate means. Tino Fiumara was exactly that kind of soldier. He was intelligent, observant, and patient. He didn't need the spotlight, didn't crave recognition, didn't care about being famous. He cared about power, real power, the kind that came from controlling infrastructure that society couldn't function without. While other young mobsters dreamed of being tough guys with guns, Tino dreamed of being the invisible hand that turned valves and decided what flowed through them. In his late teens and early 20s, Tino Fiumara began his apprenticeship in the Genovese crime family, learning from some of the most sophisticated criminals in America. The Genovese weren't like other families. They operated with military discipline, strict hierarchies, and an obsession with secrecy. They believed that the best mobster was one nobody knew about, that the most successful crimes were ones that looked like legitimate business, and that violence should be rare, surgical, and purposeful rather than constant and reckless. Tino absorbed these lessons like a sponge. He learned how to infiltrate unions by identifying weak or corrupt officials and offering them deals they couldn't refuse. He learned how to skim money from legitimate businesses without leaving traces that accountants or investigators could follow. He learned how to maintain relationships with politicians and police without ever appearing in photos or documents. Most importantly, he learned patience, the understanding that building a criminal empire takes decades, not years, and that rushing leads to mistakes that can destroy everything. His early work focused on the Newark waterfront, where the Genovese family had controlled operations since the days of Prohibition. The docks were a gold mine. Every container that passed through represented opportunities for theft, smuggling, or extortion. Trucking companies that wanted to move goods paid tribute. Shipping companies that wanted labor peace paid protection. Importers who wanted their cargo to arrive undamaged paid insurance. And behind it all, invisible but omnipresent, was the Genovese family collecting their percentage. Tino's role was to manage these operations, to ensure that money flowed smoothly, that problems were solved before they became crises, and that law enforcement never found anything worth investigating. He was a problem solver and negotiator, someone who could walk into a hostile room and walk out with an agreement. He didn't threaten. He simply explained reality in ways that made cooperation seem like the only rational choice. And slowly, steadily, he built a reputation within the family as someone reliable, intelligent, and absolutely loyal. By the 1960s, Tino had been formally inducted into the Genovese family, taking the oath, becoming a made man. But unlike many mobsters who treated their induction as permission to act recklessly, Tino became even more careful. He understood that being made meant being watched, by law enforcement, by rival families, by ambitious younger mobsters looking to move up. So he operated even more quietly, even more invisibly, building his empire in shadows so deep that even other Genovese members didn't fully understand the scope of his operations. While the Genovese family's headquarters were in New York, their New Jersey operations were equally important and arguably more profitable. New Jersey was where the family controlled the docks, the unions, the garbage industry, construction, and countless legitimate businesses that served as fronts for criminal enterprises. And Tino Fiumara was rapidly becoming the most important figure in the New Jersey faction, the man who made everything work. His power base was built on three pillars: the waterfront, the unions, and the construction industry. On the waterfront, he controlled the International Longshoremen's Association locals, which gave him power over every container that moved through the port. If Tino didn't want something moved, it didn't move. If he wanted something stolen, it disappeared. If he wanted to smuggle something in or out, nobody asked questions. The docks were his kingdom, and longshoremen, truckers, and shipping companies all paid tribute to the king. His union control extended beyond the waterfront. Tino had influence in construction unions, Teamster locals, and service worker organizations. This gave him leverage over construction projects throughout New Jersey, allowing the Genovese family to extort contractors, skim from union pension funds, and ensure that only mob-approved companies got the most lucrative contracts. Every major construction project in New Jersey during the 1960s and 1970s had Tino Fiumara's invisible fingerprints on it. Money flowing into his pockets from buildings he never personally owned but completely controlled. The construction racket was particularly lucrative. Developers who wanted their projects completed on time and without labor problems paid Tino protection money. Concrete companies that wanted to supply projects paid tribute. Trucking companies that wanted to haul materials paid fees. It was a comprehensive system of extortion disguised as labor consulting, and it generated millions annually. And because everything appeared legitimate on paper, union contracts, consulting agreements, service fees, it was almost impossible for law enforcement to prosecute. But Tino's most impressive achievement was how invisible he remained. While other mobsters appeared in newspapers, got arrested in public spectacles, or became known to everyone in their neighborhoods, Tino operated like a ghost. He didn't own flashy cars, didn't live in mansions, didn't eat at high-profile restaurants. He lived modestly, met people in private, and conducted business in ways that left no trails. Law enforcement knew he existed. His name appeared in FBI files, but they struggled to build cases against him because he never did anything that could be definitively proven as criminal. In the 1980s, Vincent the Chin Gigante became boss of the Genovese family, and he brought with him a level of paranoia and discipline that made the family even more difficult to penetrate. The Chin famously pretended to be mentally ill, wandering the streets of Greenwich Village in a bathrobe, mumbling to himself, attending psychiatric appointments, all to avoid prosecution by appearing incompetent to stand trial. It was a brilliant act that fooled nobody in law enforcement but created enough reasonable doubt to keep him out of prison for years. Tino Fiumara thrived under the Chin's leadership. Gigante understood the value of soldiers like Tino. Smart, disciplined, invisible operators who made money without causing problems. While the Chin played his madman act in Manhattan, Tino ran the New Jersey operations with ruthless efficiency, generating millions for the family while maintaining the lowest possible profile. They were perfect complements. The Chin drew attention with his eccentric behavior, while Tino operated in shadows that the Chin's performance helped create. During this period, Tino expanded his operations beyond traditional mob rackets. He got involved in stock fraud schemes, using his connections to manipulate penny stocks and pump-and-dump operations that defrauded investors of millions. He invested in legitimate businesses, restaurants, construction companies, waste management firms, using them both to launder money and to generate legal income. He maintained relationships with corrupt politicians, union officials, and business leaders, creating a network that gave him influence far beyond what his official position suggested. But Tino also understood that the era of the traditional mob was changing. Federal RICO laws were decimating crime families across America. Informants were flipping at unprecedented rates. Wiretaps and surveillance technology made it harder to operate secretly. The FBI had shifted resources to fighting organized crime, and they were getting good at it. Tino saw colleagues and friends being indicted, convicted, sent to prison for decades. And he adapted, becoming even more careful, even more selective about who he worked with, even more paranoid about security. In 1953, in response to rampant corruption on the New York and New Jersey waterfront, the Waterfront Commission was created to combat organized crime's control of the docks. For decades, the commission had limited success. The mob was too entrenched, too powerful, too connected to eliminate. But in the 1980s and 1990s, as federal prosecutors intensified their efforts, the commission became more effective, investigating mob influence in unions, prosecuting corrupt officials, and slowly dismantling the infrastructure that had allowed families like the Genovese to control the waterfront for generations. Tino Fiumara was a primary target. The commission knew he controlled multiple ILA locals, knew he extorted money from shipping companies and truckers, knew he was the Genovese family's waterfront chief. But knowing and proving were different things. Tino had built his operation to be prosecution-proof, with layers of insulation between himself and actual crimes, with intermediaries who handled the dirty work, with money that flowed through so many legitimate businesses that tracing it was nearly impossible. The commission's investigations revealed the scope of mob control over the waterfront. They documented systematic theft from cargo containers, with millions in goods stolen annually. They exposed extortion schemes where companies paid protection money just to operate. They identified corrupt union officials who sold out their members to enrich themselves and their mob masters. But connecting these crimes directly to Tino Fiumara remained frustratingly difficult. He was the ghost behind the operation, the architect who built the machine but never personally touched the stolen goods or collected the extorted money. Still, the pressure was intensifying. The commission succeeded in removing some corrupt union officials, prosecuting lower-level mobsters, and making the waterfront more difficult to exploit. Tino had to adapt, becoming even more cautious, relying even more on intermediaries, and shifting some operations away from the docks to other industries where law enforcement wasn't watching as closely. But he never abandoned the waterfront entirely. It was his birthright, his kingdom, his source of power. He would fight to maintain control as long as he could. What set Tino Fiumara apart from other mobsters wasn't just his intelligence or his business acumen. It was his complete commitment to invisibility. While other crime family leaders appeared in newspapers, got photographed at restaurants, and became known to the public, Tino remained a ghost. Most Americans have never heard his name. Even many people in New Jersey who lived through his reign of power don't know who he was. And that was exactly how he wanted it. He lived in a modest home in New Jersey, drove ordinary cars, dressed like a middle-class businessman. He didn't wear expensive jewelry, didn't flash money, didn't act like a mob boss from Central Casting. When he met with associates, it was in private homes, quiet restaurants, or industrial areas where nobody paid attention. He rarely spoke on the phone, and when he did, he used coded language that meant nothing to anyone listening. He operated on the assumption that law enforcement was always watching, always listening, and he conducted his life accordingly. This discipline was rare in organized crime. Most mobsters couldn't resist the temptation to enjoy their wealth publicly, to be recognized and respected, to live like kings. But Tino understood that visibility was death. Every photo was evidence, every witness was a potential informant, every public display was a gift to prosecutors building cases. So he lived like a monk, a very wealthy monk who controlled millions in criminal enterprises, but a monk nonetheless in terms of his public presentation. His discipline extended to violence. Unlike many mobsters who used murder as a tool for settling petty disputes or demonstrating power, Tino approved violence only when absolutely necessary and always with careful planning to minimize exposure. People who threatened the organization disappeared quietly. Bodies never found. Investigations leading nowhere. There were no dramatic shootouts, no bodies left in public as messages. Just disappearances that police couldn't investigate because there was no evidence a crime had occurred. By the 1980s, the FBI's Newark office had become obsessed with bringing down Tino Fiumara. They knew he was one of the most powerful mobsters in New Jersey, knew he controlled the waterfront, knew he was making millions from extortion and theft. But knowing and proving remained frustratingly separate. Special agents spent years trying to build a case, deploying surveillance teams, installing wiretaps, pressuring his associates to cooperate. But Tino's security was too good, his operation too carefully constructed. his discipline too absolute. The FBI tried everything. They followed him everywhere, photographed everyone he met, analyzed his financial records looking for unexplained income. They raided businesses connected to him, arrested his associates, offered deals to get people to flip. They installed bugs in places he was known to frequent, hoping to catch incriminating conversations. But Tino was always one step ahead. He seemed to instinctively know when he was being watched, when rooms might be bugged, when conversations might be recorded. His counter-surveillance instincts were legendary within both the FBI and the mob. One FBI agent who worked the Fiumara case for years later said in an interview that Tino was one of the most difficult targets he'd ever pursued. Not because he was violent or intimidating, but because he was simply too smart and too disciplined to make mistakes. Every time they thought they had something, it would evaporate under scrutiny. Witnesses would recant, evidence would prove inconclusive, connections would be too circumstantial to prosecute. It was like fighting a ghost. You could sense it was there, but you could never quite grab it. The frustration led to mistakes. In their eagerness to build a case, investigators sometimes pushed too hard, violated procedures, or relied on questionable evidence. Tino's lawyers, some of the best defense attorneys in New Jersey, would pounce on these mistakes, getting evidence suppressed, charges dismissed, cases falling apart before they reached trial. Every failure only made Tino more careful, more paranoid, and more difficult to catch. In the 1980s and 1990s, federal prosecutors launched a comprehensive assault on mob-controlled unions, using RICO laws to file civil suits seeking to place unions under government supervision. The strategy was brilliant. Rather than prosecuting individual mobsters for specific crimes, they would demonstrate that entire unions had been corrupted by organized crime and required federal oversight to clean up. And the International Longshoremen's Association, where Tino Fiumara wielded enormous influence, was a primary target. The federal takeovers were devastating to the mob's waterfront operations. Government-appointed monitors investigated union finances, identified corrupt officials, and reformed hiring practices that had been controlled by organized crime for decades. Jobs that had been given out as patronage to mob associates were now subject to legitimate application processes. Union pension funds that had been looted for decades were placed under independent management. The systematic theft and extortion that had sustained the mob's waterfront empire was being dismantled piece by piece. Tino fought back through his lawyers, challenging the takeovers in court, arguing that the federal government was overreaching, that the unions were being unfairly targeted. But the evidence of corruption was overwhelming. Decades of financial irregularities, testimony from former members about mob influence, documentation of sweetheart contracts that benefited organized crime. The courts sided with the government, and the takeovers proceeded. The loss of union control was a massive blow to Tino's operations. Without the ability to control hiring on the docks, he couldn't guarantee that mob-friendly workers would be in position to facilitate theft and smuggling. Without access to union funds, he lost a major source of income. Without the power to call strikes or slow down work, he lost leverage over shipping companies and trucking firms. The waterfront empire that had sustained his power for decades was crumbling, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. But Tino was nothing if not adaptable. As his waterfront operations declined, he shifted focus to other rackets: gambling, loan sharking, stock fraud, construction extortion. He couldn't replace the money he was losing from the docks, but he could diversify, spread his operations across multiple industries, make himself less vulnerable to any single investigation or reform effort. It was a strategic retreat, not a surrender, the action of a man who understood that survival meant evolution. Despite his best efforts to remain invisible, the FBI finally caught up with Tino Fiumara in the early 1990s. A combination of wiretaps, cooperating witnesses, and decades of investigation produced enough evidence to indict him on federal racketeering charges. In 1993, Tino was arrested along with dozens of other Genovese family members in a massive sweep that aimed to dismantle the family's New Jersey operations once and for all. The indictment was comprehensive, charging Tino with running a criminal enterprise that included extortion, theft, loan sharking, and conspiracy. Prosecutors presented evidence of his control over waterfront unions, his involvement in construction extortion, his role in organizing cargo theft from the docks. They had wiretaps showing him discussing criminal operations, witnesses testifying about his position in the organization, financial records suggesting income that couldn't be explained through legitimate means. Tino's defense was predictable but effective. He was a legitimate businessman being persecuted because of his Italian heritage and alleged mob connections. His lawyers argued that the government's case was built on circumstantial evidence, cooperating witnesses with credibility problems, and wiretaps that could be interpreted multiple ways. They challenged every piece of evidence, attacked every witness, and forced prosecutors to prove every allegation beyond reasonable doubt. The trial lasted months. Prosecutors paraded witnesses through the courtroom. Former mobsters who'd flipped, union officials who'd cooperated, business owners who'd been extorted. They played hours of wiretaps, showing Tino discussing operations, making decisions, exercising authority. They presented financial analysis showing that his legitimate income couldn't possibly support his lifestyle and investments. It was a comprehensive case, built over years, representing thousands of hours of investigation. The jury convicted Tino on multiple racketeering counts. At age 52, he was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison. The waterfront king who'd operated in shadows for decades was finally being sent away. But even in defeat, Tino maintained his dignity and discipline. He didn't cooperate, didn't become an informant, didn't betray the code that had sustained him throughout his criminal career. He would do his time quietly, as invisible in prison as he'd been on the outside. Tino Fiumara entered federal prison in the mid-1990s, joining dozens of other Genovese family members who'd been swept up in the FBI's comprehensive assault on organized crime. For a man who'd spent his entire life operating freely, controlling operations across multiple industries, wielding power over thousands of workers, prison must have been unbearable. But if Tino suffered, he did so privately, maintaining the same discipline behind bars that had defined his life outside. He served his sentence quietly at various federal facilities, keeping to himself, avoiding trouble, doing his time like a professional. Other inmates knew who he was. Word travels in prison, especially about mobsters with reputations. But Tino didn't trade on his past. He wasn't one of those prisoners who told war stories, bragged about crimes, or tried to maintain power through violence and intimidation. He simply did his time, waiting for the day he could return to what remained of his life outside. While he was imprisoned, the world continued to change. The Genovese family was being systematically dismantled by prosecutions. Vincent Giganti, the Chin, was finally convicted and sent to prison, his madman act finally failing. The waterfront continued to be reformed, with federal monitors removing mob influence union by union, local by local. The New Jersey operations that Tino had built over decades were being taken over by younger, less disciplined mobsters who lacked his sophistication and discipline. The empire was crumbling, and there was nothing he could do from behind bars. During this period, many of Tino's associates flipped, becoming government witnesses to reduce their sentences. They testified about his operations, confirmed his role in the organization, and provided evidence that would be used in future cases. The code of silence that had once been absolute was breaking down, and Tino watched from prison as everything he'd believed in was betrayed by men who couldn't do their time without making deals. Tino Fiumara was released from federal prison in the late 2000s, walking out into a world that had changed dramatically during his incarceration. The mob was a shadow of what it had been, decimated by prosecutions, destroyed by informants, rendered largely irrelevant by cultural and economic changes that had eliminated many traditional rackets. The waterfront was mostly clean, unions were under federal supervision, and the younger generation had no interest in following in their father's criminal footsteps. But Tino was still Tino, still connected, still respected by those who remained in the life, still possessing the intelligence and discipline that had made him successful. He tried to rebuild some of his operations, reaching out to old contacts, identifying new opportunities, adapting to the changed landscape. But it was hopeless. Law enforcement was watching him constantly, ready to pounce at any sign that he was returning to criminal activity. His old rackets had been dismantled or taken over by others. The infrastructure that had supported his power no longer existed. In 2010, less than 3 years after his release, Tino was indicted again, this time on charges of extorting a labor union and controlling a loan sharking operation. The FBI had never stopped watching him, and they'd caught him attempting to return to his old ways. It was a humiliating moment for a man who'd once been one of New Jersey's most powerful mobsters. Proof that he couldn't let go of the life even when continuing it meant certain imprisonment. He was convicted again and sentenced to another stretch in federal prison. This time, there was no empire to return to, no operations to manage from the inside, no future waiting beyond the bars. He was just another old mobster who couldn't adapt, couldn't retire, couldn't accept that his era was over. The ghost who'd once controlled the waterfront was now just a tired old man shuffling through a prison yard. His kingdom gone, his power evaporated, his legacy reduced to FBI files and history books that almost nobody reads. Tino Fiumara died on September 16, 2010, while serving his sentence in a federal medical facility. He was 69 years old. His death barely made the news, a small obituary in New Jersey papers, a brief mention in mob history websites. Nothing that reflected the enormous power he'd once wielded. He died as he'd lived, invisibly, quietly, without fanfare or public recognition. Most people in New Jersey, even those who'd worked on the docks or in industries he'd controlled, had never heard his name. His funeral was small, attended by family and a handful of old associates who'd managed to avoid prison or death. There were no processions of black cars, no crowds of mourners, no media circus. The FBI photographed everyone who attended, adding names to their files, but by then it barely mattered. The organization Tino had served was essentially extinct, the rackets he'd controlled were gone, and the younger generation had moved on to different forms of crime or legitimate careers. But Tino Fiumara's legacy lives on in the infrastructure of corruption he helped build. The techniques he pioneered, infiltrating unions, corrupting officials, using legitimate businesses as fronts, are still employed by organized crime today. The waterfront, though much cleaner than in Tino's era, still struggles with periodic allegations of mob influence. And the Genovese family, though diminished, still exists, still operates, still uses variations of the methods that Tino perfected over his long criminal career. Tino Fiumara's story teaches a lesson that most criminals never learn. True power requires invisibility. While other mobsters chased fame, got their faces on magazine covers, became household names, Tino operated in shadows so deep that even decades of FBI investigation couldn't fully illuminate them. He understood that the moment you become visible, the moment people know your name, you've already started losing. His invisibility was his superpower. It allowed him to operate for decades while flashier mobsters rose and fell. It protected him from assassination attempts by rivals who didn't know enough about him to target him effectively. It made building cases against him extraordinarily difficult because witnesses couldn't identify him, couldn't testify about his direct involvement in crimes. He was the master of plausible deniability, always one step removed from actual criminality, always able to claim he was just a businessman caught up in circumstances beyond his control. But his story also reveals the ultimate futility of this approach. Despite his discipline, despite his intelligence, despite his decades of careful operation, he still ended up where almost all mobsters end up. In prison, dying old and powerless, his empire destroyed, his legacy forgotten by all but historians and former FBI agents. The invisibility that protected him for so long also ensured that when he finally fell, there was nobody left to remember what he'd built, nobody to mourn what was lost. Today, the Port of New York and New Jersey is one of the busiest in America, with billions in cargo moving through annually. It's been largely cleaned up. Federal monitors have removed most mob influence from the unions. Hiring practices have been reformed, and systematic theft and extortion have been dramatically reduced. The Waterfront Commission continues its work, investigating allegations of corruption, prosecuting criminals, maintaining vigilance against organized crime's attempts to return. But those who know the history understand that ghosts remain. The techniques Tino Fiumara pioneered, the shell companies, the corrupt officials, the systematic skimming, are still being used in modified forms. The FBI still investigates mob activity on the docks, still finds evidence of extortion and theft, still arrests people connected to organized crime families. The waterfront has been cleaned up significantly, but it hasn't been completely purified. It probably never will be. And somewhere in the machinery of commerce, in the complex systems that move goods from ships to trucks to warehouses to stores, there are still people following Tino Fiumara's blueprint. They're not as powerful, not as organized, not as successful as he was, but they're trying. They're looking for the gaps, the vulnerabilities, the opportunities to skim a little here, extort a little there, build small empires in the shadows where law enforcement isn't watching as closely. They're the inheritors of Tino's legacy, proof that his methods were so effective that they survive even after his empire has fallen. Tino Fiumara's story raises uncomfortable questions about how much we don't know about organized crime. If he could operate for decades as one of New Jersey's most powerful mobsters while remaining virtually unknown to the public, how many others are out there doing the same thing right now? How many invisible criminals are controlling industries, corrupting officials, making millions from illegal enterprises while maintaining public profiles as legitimate businessmen? The FBI estimates that organized crime costs America billions annually, but those estimates are necessarily incomplete because much of organized crime is, by definition, hidden. Tino proved that the most successful criminals are the ones nobody knows about, the ones who appear in no headlines, who become legends only after they're caught or dead. He was discovered and prosecuted despite his precautions. How many others have been even more careful, even more successful at avoiding detection? His story is a reminder that the organized crime we see, the arrests, the trials, the sensational stories, is only the tip of the iceberg. Below the surface, invisible to public view, there are probably dozens or hundreds of people following similar paths, building criminal empires in shadows, corrupting systems, making fortunes while the rest of us remain oblivious. Tino Fiumara was one of the few who got caught. The others are still out there, still operating, still following the blueprint he helped perfect. In the pantheon of American organized crime, Tino Fiumara will never be as famous as Al Capone, as notorious as John Gotti, as written about as Meyer Lansky. Most Americans have never heard his name and never will. But in many ways, that makes him more representative of organized crime's reality than any of those famous figures. Because for every flashy mobster who makes headlines, there are dozens like Tino. Intelligent, disciplined, invisible operators who build criminal empires while the public focuses on the celebrities. He proved that the most dangerous criminals aren't the ones we fear, but the ones we don't even know exist. They're not shooting people in the street or making threats in restaurants. They're corrupting systems, infiltrating industries, using intelligence and patience instead of violence and intimidation. They're the ghosts in the machinery of commerce and government, the invisible hands that turn valves and redirect flows of money and power. And they're far more dangerous than any street thug because they're so much harder to detect and stop. Tino Fiumara spent his life proving that invisibility is the ultimate weapon in organized crime. He built an empire that lasted decades, survived FBI investigations that destroyed others, and operated with a level of sophistication that made him almost impossible to prosecute. He failed in the end, as all criminals eventually do. But he lasted longer than most, made more money than most, and caused more damage than most. Not because he was the toughest or most violent, but because he was the smartest and most invisible. Tino Fiumara proved that the most powerful mobsters aren't the ones whose names everyone knows. They're the ones whose names nobody knows. While Gotti posed for cameras and Capone made headlines, Tino controlled the waterfront, owned the unions, and corrupted an entire industry without ever appearing in a newspaper. He was the ghost in the machinery, the invisible hand that moved billions in cargo and millions in illegal profits. For 50 years, he ruled New Jersey's docks while remaining unknown to the people who work them. He understood the fundamental truth that all successful criminals eventually learn. Fame is death, visibility is prison, and the only way to win is to never let anyone know you're playing. The FBI finally caught him eventually. But how many others followed his blueprint and never got caught? How many invisible empires exist right now, controlled by ghosts we'll never see until it's too late? That's Tino Fiumara's real legacy. Not the empire he built, but the proof that the most dangerous criminals are the ones we don't even know exist.